In the complex geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East during the Cold War, few stories illustrate the tensions between national loyalty and personal convictions as dramatically as the trajectory of Heba Selim, a young Egyptian woman born in 1947 who would become one of the most effective agents of the Israeli intelligence service in the heart of the Arab world. Her story, which unfolded between the elegant salons of Paris and the military offices of Cairo, represents one of the most controversial cases of international espionage during one of the most volatile periods of modern Middle Eastern history. Originally from the city of Asyut in Upper Egypt, Heba grew up in the sophisticated Mohandesin district of Cairo, an enclave of the Egyptian upper middle class, where cosmopolitan aspirations mixed with Arab traditions. The daughter of an educated family, she demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for foreign languages from an early age, especially French, which led her to pursue higher studies at the Faculty of Arts of Ain Shams University, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in Egypt. She was a brilliant young woman, described by those who knew her as charismatic, intelligent, and deeply idealistic, characteristics that would later prove fundamental both for her recruitment and her eventual downfall. Heba's fate took an irreversible turn when one of her French professors at the university, recognizing her exceptional academic talent, offered her the opportunity to pursue further studies at the prestigious Sorbonne University in Paris. This proposal, which should have represented the pinnacle of academic aspirations for any young Egyptian woman of her generation, became the first link in a chain of events that would lead her to the center of one of the world's most sophisticated spy networks. In Paris, she settled with an Egyptian family and quickly integrated into the diplomatic circles of the French capital, regularly frequenting the residence of the Egyptian ambassador, Fakhri Othman, who would later describe her as an attractive, cheerful, brilliant, and patriotic young woman, although she faced significant financial difficulties because she could not find work at the Egyptian embassy. It was precisely this financial vulnerability that created the conditions for her recruitment by the Mossad. During her studies in Paris, Heba met a colleague of Polish-Jewish origin who invited her to a party at her home, an apparently innocent social event that would turn out to be the first step in a meticulously planned recruitment operation. At this gathering, surrounded by enthusiastic Jewish youths, Heba was exposed to a carefully constructed narrative about Israeli aspirations for regional peace, a theme that resonated deeply with her own pacifist convictions. The party organizers showed her films about life in Israel, portraying the country as a modern, urbanized democracy, deliberately contrasting it with the image of conflict and instability that dominated Arab perceptions of the Jewish state. The Mossad's recruitment strategy was based on exploiting Heba's genuine pacifist aspirations, presenting collaboration with Israel not as betrayal, but as a contribution to a future of regional peace and stability. This sophisticated psychological approach, typical of the most effective intelligence operations, succeeded in transforming an idealistic young woman into a convinced collaborator who genuinely believed she was working to preserve the human race from destruction, as she herself would declare years later to General Rifayat Osman Gabriel during her last days on death row. The operation demonstrated the Mossad's mastery in identifying and exploiting the deepest psychological motivations of its targets, transforming personal convictions into instruments of international espionage. Heba's return to Egypt marked the beginning of the operational phase of her mission. Armed with training in espionage techniques and an unwavering conviction about the righteousness of her cause, she initiated what the Mossad internally called a honey trap operation, a classic espionage technique that exploited romantic relationships to gain access to classified information. The target had been carefully selected. Lieutenant Colonel Farouk El-Fiki, an Egyptian military engineer she had met at the exclusive Al Jazeera Club, one of the meeting places for Cairo's military and social elite. Farouk, described by colleagues as a competent and dedicated officer, quickly fell in love with the charismatic young woman, without suspecting that their romance was being orchestrated by the Israeli intelligence services. The relationship between Heba and Farouk evolved naturally, at least in the Egyptian officer's perception. But every meeting, every casual conversation, every moment of intimacy was carefully exploited by Heba to extract information about Egyptian defensive capabilities. Farouk, completely emotionally involved, began to share details about his work, including information about the locations of Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries, newly acquired missile systems from the Soviet Union, and the sophisticated 2K-12 Cub systems that form the backbone of the Egyptian air defense. This information, transmitted by Hiba through clandestine channels established by the Mossad, began to form a detailed picture of Egyptian military vulnerabilities that would prove fatal during the Yom Kippur War. The crucial moment came when Farouk discovered the true nature of his fiancée's activities. Confronted with the reality that the woman he loved was an Israeli spy, the Egyptian officer faced a choice that would define not only his personal destiny, but also the course of subsequent military events. Surprisingly, instead of reporting Hiba to the authorities, Farouk made the extraordinary decision to become her conscious accomplice. This decision, which remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire operation, may have been motivated by love, by his own doubts about the Arab-Israeli conflict, or simply by the realization that his situation was already irreversibly compromised. Regardless of his motivations, Farouk began to actively collaborate in the collection of military intelligence, using his privileged position to provide the Mossad with even more detailed and accurate information about Egyptian defenses. The collaboration between Hiba and Farouk intensified dramatically in the months leading up to the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. Using sophisticated clandestine communication techniques, including letters written with invisible ink, the couple transmitted to the Mossad detailed maps of the positions of Egyptian missiles, technical specifications of the new Soviet weaponry systems, and crucial information about the modernization plans for the Egyptian air defense. This information was not merely abstract military data. It represented years of Egyptian strategic planning, millions of dollars in investment in Soviet equipment, and the defensive structure upon which Egypt based its military strategy for a future confrontation with Israel. Every document transmitted by Farouk represented a piece of the puzzle that would allow the Israeli air forces to navigate with deadly precision through the Egyptian defenses. When the Yom Kippur War erupted on October 6, 1973, with the coordinated attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces against Israel, the intelligence provided by Hiba and Farouk revealed its devastating strategic value. Israeli pilots, equipped with precise information about the locations of Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries, managed to execute airstrikes with a precision that left Egyptian military commanders dumbfounded. Missile base after missile base was destroyed with surgical efficiency, eliminating what should have been the main line of defense against Israeli air superiority. The human and material cost to Egypt was devastating. Hundreds of soldiers lost their lives in the explosions that obliterated the defensive installations, while millions of dollars in Soviet military equipment were reduced to smoking rubble. The accuracy of the Israeli attacks was so extraordinary that it quickly raised suspicions among Egyptian military commanders. Experienced generals, veterans of previous conflicts, recognized that such a level of precision could only be achieved with exceptionally detailed and up-to-date intelligence information. Initial suspicions of security leaks rapidly evolved into a formal investigation conducted by the Egyptian intelligence services, which began to systematically examine all officers with access to information about defensive positions. General Rifat Osman Gabriel, responsible for the investigation, initially focused his suspicions on the highest ranks of the military command, as only a very limited number of officers had full access to the data on missile positions. The counterintelligence operation, conducted with the urgency imposed by the war situation, gradually narrowed the circle until suspicious patterns were identified in Farouk el-Fiqi's communications. The discovery of the letters with invisible ink sent by Farouk marked the beginning of the end for the Mossad's most successful espionage operation on Egyptian territory. The Egyptian authorities, facing the reality that their national defense had been compromised by one of their own officers, reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and a determination to extract the full truth about the extent of the Israeli infiltration. During initial interrogations, Farouk tried to resist, but the psychological pressure and the accumulated material evidence against him made his position untenable. Eventually, confronted with irrefutable proof of his betrayal, He confessed not only his own espionage activities, but also revealed the central role of Heba Selim as his recruiter and Mossad handler. This confession opened a new dimension in the investigation, transforming what initially appeared to be an isolated case of military treason into a long-term international espionage operation. The revelation of Heba Selim's name to the Egyptian authorities triggered an international counterintelligence operation to capture the Mossad agent who was still free on French territory. The Egyptian security services, coordinating with their Libyan counterparts and utilizing established diplomatic channels, devised a meticulously detailed plan to lure Heba out of the relative safety that Paris offered. The strategy was based on exploiting the spy's deepest family ties, using false information that would be impossible for her to ignore. The news that her father had been hospitalized in critical condition in Tripoli, Libya, and that her presence was urgently needed. This information, transmitted through channels that seemed legitimate, was carefully constructed to appear authentic and to create the sense of urgency that would force Heba to abandon any precautions she might have developed during her years of clandestine work. The role of the Egyptian ambassador in Paris, Fakhri Othman, in the operation to capture Heba revealed the diplomatic dimension of the case and the determination of the Egyptian authorities to bring the spy back to face justice. Othman, who had hosted Heba in his residence during the years she was an apparently innocent student, now found himself in the position of facilitating her capture. The irony of the situation did not escape observers. The same diplomatic hospitality that had provided Heba with a respectable entry into Egyptian circles in Paris now became the instrument of her downfall. When Heba boarded the flight to Tripoli, genuinely believing she was rushing to the aid of her dying father, she was, in reality, walking directly into a meticulously prepared trap by the intelligence services that had been trying for years to discover the identity of the source of the military leaks. Heba's arrest at Tripoli airport was executed with military precision. The Libyan authorities, coordinating with their Egyptian colleagues, were prepared for her arrival and detained her immediately upon her entry into Libyan territory. Without delay, she was transferred to an Egyptian aircraft that transported her back to Cairo, where she would face not only the reality of her capture, but also the prospect of a trial for high treason. During the return flight, as she watched the waters of the Mediterranean give way to the sands of the Egyptian desert through the aircraft window, Heba must have fully understood that her career as a spy had come to an end, and that her life was likely also about to end. The young woman who had left Egypt as an idealistic student now returned as one of the country's most wanted spies. The trial of Heba Selim and Farouk el-Fiqi became one of the most sensational cases in modern Egyptian judicial history, not only due to the extraordinary nature of the crimes, but also because of the broader geopolitical implications the case revealed. The Egyptian courts faced the complex task of judging not only individual acts of treason, but also of examining how such a sophisticated espionage operation had managed to operate in the heart of the Egyptian military establishment for years without detection. Heba's case was tried by a civilian court, as she was a civilian at the time of the crimes, while Farouk faced a military court-martial, reflecting the different legal jurisdictions applicable to the two defendants. During the legal proceedings, the details of the espionage operation gradually emerged, revealing not only the extent of the information transmitted, but also the sophistication of the operational techniques employed by the Mossad. International attempts to intercede on behalf of the convicted individuals added a complex diplomatic dimension to the case. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, recognizing the potential implications of the case for peace efforts in the Middle East, made a personal appeal to President Anwar Sadat, requesting clemency for the defendants. This appeal, coming from the highest level of American diplomacy, reflected not only humanitarian considerations, but also strategic calculations about the impact the executions could have on the delicate peace negotiations underway between Egypt and Israel. However, Sadat, facing considerable internal pressure and the need to demonstrate that betrayal would have severe consequences, rejected the plea for clemency. His decision reflected the political reality that any appearance of leniency toward Israeli espionage could be interpreted as weakness by the more radical elements of Egyptian society and the Arab world in general. The execution of Hiba Salim by hanging and Farouk el-Fiki by firing squad in 1974 marked the tragic end of one of the most successful espionage operations in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The different forms of execution reflected Egyptian legal distinctions between crimes committed by civilians and military personnel. But the final outcome was the same. 2 young lives were lost as a consequence of choices that had been shaped by ideology, love, conviction, and ultimately by the inexorable pressures of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Hiba's death not only closed her personal story, but also served as a somber reminder of the human costs of the intelligence conflicts that characterized the Cold War. Her story, later immortalized in the 1978 Egyptian film Al-Sud Ela Al-Hawiya, Ascending to the Abyss, became an enduring symbol of the moral and political complexities that defined an era of unprecedented international espionage in the Middle East. Hiba Salim's legacy transcends her individual biography to touch upon broader issues of national loyalty, personal conviction, and the moral ambiguities inherent in international espionage during periods of high geopolitical tension. Her story illustrates how individuals can be transformed from idealistic students into agents of foreign powers through psychologically sophisticated recruitment techniques that exploit genuine aspirations for peace and justice. The case also demonstrates how successful intelligence operations can have devastating strategic impacts, altering the military balance between nations and influencing the course of international conflicts. Furthermore, the saga of Hiba and Farouk serves as a case study on how personal relationships can be instrumentalized for espionage purposes, revealing the deeply problematic human dimensions of modern intelligence operations. Finally, her execution and the subsequent creation of a cinematographic narrative around her story demonstrate how espionage cases become elements of the national cultural memory, serving both as warnings about the dangers of betrayal and as reflections on the moral complexities of international conflicts in the modern world.